Now what we will need to do is go in and actually make a tension swatch, because without the tension swatch we cannot make our first garment. We have chosen for our exercises using the silky yarn for the standard gauge machine and using Nordic for the bulky machine. In a tension swatch, you will use 30 stitches on your bulky knitting machines. You will use 60 stitches on your standard gauge machine. You always want to cast on with scrap and ravel cord. Now there are three ways, to do a tension swatch. We will do 2 of those on the bulky. We will do the third one on the standard gauge machine. You want to first of all cast on with one of the methods that we have already showed you. And I will use the weaving cast on so that it is a finished cast on, but it won't ravel back on me. So again, to review that, I am bringing every other needle all the way forward. I have brought 30 needles into actual working position, and every other one of those has been placed into holding position. I make sure my weaving brushes are on. I take my thread across the needles and I knit 1 row. Knit about 10 rows of scrap before, so that you know that everything is knitting all right for you. You can either use your cast-on comb or your edge weights at this point. While we are still in our scrap yarn, what we are going to do is mark the tension that we are knitting our garment at. And the tension is, of course, what our tension dial is set at. If your tension dial has been set at 1 because of the yarn that you are using, you will make 1 hole by taking 1 stitch, transferring it over to the next stitch. If our tension dial was set up to tension 4, here we have made 1. Now we would move over a needle and make 2, move over another needle, make the 3rd hole, and then move over another needle, making the 4th hole. The purpose of doing this is so that when you make your swatches and you don't go back to knitting with them for a few weeks or a couple of days, you'll remember what tension you knitted that swatch at. Likewise, on your tension dial, you not only have the solid settings, you have point settings. And you may knit this at tension 4.1 or you may knit it at tension 4.2. If you were to do that, you would skip a number of needles after making your 4 holes, and you would make either 1 or 2 depending on the point that you used on your tension dial. Making sure that those needles that you just transferred are still in working position and not all the way back, you will knit a couple of more rows. At this point, we will change to our main color yarn. You will also set your row counter to 0. And in order to make your row counter work, you need to have this button down on your machine. We will knit 5 rows. And now we want to place markers so that we can read this tension swatch. So first of all, I will break myself 2 pieces of thread. And on needle number 10, because on the bulky we measure 20 stitches, I will place a marker. If you are doing your swatch on the standard gauge machine, you will do this on needle number 20 because it's on 40 stitches that we need to measure our swatch. After making those markers and tying them so that they don't come off of your work, then you will knit another 10 rows and do another marker. Once you have done this marker, then you will knit your final set of rows, which on the bulky is a total of 30 rows. On the standard gauge machine, it's a total of 60 rows. You do need to place your markers every 10 rows for accurate measuring purposes. Once you have knit the number of rows required, then you will remove your thread from the main color yarn from the feeder and thread back in your contrast yarn and scrap off your work. On the bulkies, I recommend that you latch tool off around the post because you can have your work ravel back on you before you can get to measuring it. On the standard gauge machines, you don't always have to bind off around the post, but if you're going to treat your tension swatch as you should before you make your garment, it should be bound off for accurate reading purposes. What we will be doing now is a tension swatch on the standard gauge machine, giving you a different way to do that tension swatch. First of all, you will scrap on with scrap yarn. After knitting several rows of scrap, again you want to remember that you need to set the gauge that you were knitting your tension at on the needle bed by transferring stitches over and marking the appropriate tension that you are knitting with. With this particular yarn, we would knit at a tension 5 or 6. After making the appropriate number of holes, you will knit a few rows across and change to your main color yarn. You also at this point want to take and transfer needle number 21 on each side of 0 over to needle number 22 and place needle 21 completely out of work. This particular type of gauge only works on your standard gauge machine. We will thread our carriage, adjust our row counter to 0, and knit 60 rows. After knitting your 60 rows, you can return those empty needles back into working position. Rethread with scrap yarn and scrap your swatch off.